Hello, I'm Scott Gilbert, and I'm going to be talking right now about the question, when does personhood begin? I'll be talking about both the biology and the rhetoric of this question, and quite honestly, I wish I could be sitting on opposite sides of a table with some coffee, wine, or tea, but as it is, I have to be standing up and giving this talk. I've given similar talks to priests at the Vatican and to physicians and nurses at the annual meeting of Planned Parenthood. So this is a talk about why we believe certain things. The main objectives that I have is first to understand the biological reasons why different groups of scientists claim that embryos become persons at different stages of development, and that there is no scientific consensus as to when an embryo is a person. I also want to understand some of the rhetoric of public media that might predispose a person to think that there is a consensus that personhood begins at fertilization. What I will not be doing is telling you when personhood begins. I'll just be critiquing those people who say they do know when personhood begins. So really, this is what I am going to contest. This is a statement made by presidential hopeful Michael Huckabee saying pro-life is scientific. Biologically, life begins at conception. That's irrefutable from a biological standpoint. Actually, it is refutable from a biological standpoint. And I am going to try to say that there are other places where groups of scientists have claimed that personhood begins. But first, why might the public assume that life does begin at fertilization? Well, we citizens are being told, first, that all the instructions for development and heredity are in the fertilized egg. Two, that the newly implanted embryo normally develops into a newborn baby, and it constitutes an autonomous self. And third, we're told that there's a consensus among scientists that personhood begins at fertilization. Each of these principles is false, and we'll go through them. First, the notion that the instructions for development and heredity are all in the fertilized egg. And here we see two quotations saying that everything you are, your personality, the way you look, they are all inherited and they're given to you by the sperm and the egg at the moment of conception. This is a very popular fallacy. It's a fallacy that sociologist Dorothy Nelkin and historian Susan Lindy call the fallacy of sacred DNA. Now, they look to see how is DNA being represented in popular media. They didn't look at Nature and Science and proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They looked at Red Book, Cosmopolitan, Vogue, Newsweek, New York Times, things that people in the general public might actually read. And what they found was fascinating. They found that DNA was being represented as your soul. It's that which is your essence, that which determines your behaviors, and although not being a soul, that from which you can be resurrected after death, a la Jurassic Park. That there's something sacred about DNA. And one sees this being depicted throughout the public media. We even see it on the cover of Nature magazine, where this is, of course, takeoff on Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, God's hand touching atoms, and what's going through it is a homology map of a human chromosome. So even biologists can be talking about sacred DNA. What we see is that there's both religious groups and scientific groups that are talking about DNA as being, this sacred entity that determines who you are. We see this throughout the media. This is a headline from my local paper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, finding the warrior gene. It determines whether you're fretful or forceful, so that even your behaviors depend on the single gene. Here's another piece of genetic determinism from 2010. Fox News reports saying, don't hold liberals responsible for their opinion. They can't help themselves. A new study has concluded that ideology is not just a social thing, it's built into the DNA, borne along by a gene called DRD4, tagged the liberal gene, DRD4 is the first specific bit of human DNA that predisposes people to certain political views, the study's authors claim. Actually, the authors didn't really claim that. But this is a piece of journalism that talks about genes being responsible for your behaviors. Do we see this in other places? We certainly do. I often ask my students, do cars have genes? And after looking at each other, they basically conclude they don't. But we are told they do. Here's the ad for the mid-sized Hummer. Same DNA, smaller chromosomes. In other words, the essence is the same, just a smaller package. And here's a Sportage. Again, new set of genes. So we're talking here about genes being responsible for behaviors as well as the physical phenotype. Is this the case? Actually, no. Genes alone do not control who or what we are. So here we see two genetically identical mice. And they don't look genetically identical. One is golden and obese, the other is sleek and brown. The genetically identical mice are from mothers that were fed different diets. And the diet caused them, not the genes, the diet caused them to be different. And here's Eng and Chang Bunker. Eng was a rather happy fellow. He was a teetotaler. He did not drink. Chang, however, who was more morose, liked his whiskey. They shared a common liver, which caused problems, but they just had an agreement. 1 week Eng would rule, 1 week Chang would rule, and they got along just fine. Now, these identical twins were identical not only in their environment, they were conjoined twins, but in their genes. So they were different people despite having the same genes and the same environment. So genes alone certainly don't control who or what we are. As a matter of fact, maternal care affects gene activation in the brain. And this was shown by a number of studies showing that maternal licking and grooming in rats would cause hormones to form, and the hormones would actually change gene expression in the brain, and this change in gene expression was correlated with lack or presence of anxiety. Maternal care, diet, all sorts of things can determine who we are, not merely genes. So this notion of the gene as determining our physical and our psychological makeup, the notion of the gene as soul is wrong. It is not our essence. So the new syllabus would say that we are not determined to be essentially who or what we are at fertilization. Many of our fundamental bodily and behavioral characters are determined by the environment, not by genes. So that's the first notion that was wrong. The second error is that the implanted embryo is safe within the womb. It's an autonomous entity. And here we have one commentator saying that from the first moment of conception, human development is a fait accompli under conditions that we normally have come to understand and embrace as normal. In other words, a fertilization event normally becomes a newborn. That's not the case. Depending on the study, 60 to 80% of fertilization events fail to be born. It's most likely that embryos do not come to be born. So this notion that most conceptions become babies is false. The notion of their being autonomous is just certainly outlandish to a biologist. Now here we see a Newsweek cover says, should a fetus have rights? Is science changing the debate? But look at that fetus. It's lacking an umbilical cord. It's lacking a uterus. It's lacking a mother. It's an autonomous embryo, like a sea urchin embryo. But in mammals, autonomous embryos don't exist. They're creatures of the imagination. But this is how embryos are often presented to us. Here's another picture where you have a free-floating, looks like an extraterrestrial fetus with its own life support system resembling the Apollo spacecraft. We see this in many anti-abortion zygote rights websites. The use of the Leonard Nilsson photographs, for instance, in this particular website, the embryology is inaccurate, the dating is wrong, and they call the embryo a female, even though you cannot tell at this time. Again, this is a website for girls, and there's identification with the fetus. Also, the pictures, the Leonard Nilsson pictures, are pictures of aborted fetuses. That's not told in the Life magazine article, however. So we have a syllogism here based on this notion of this public autonomous fetus. The fetus is autonomous, that was shown in that picture. DNA appears to be sole. And what's given is that we receive our DNA at fertilization. So we're being told over and over again that fertilization is equivalent to ensoulment. That's this error that we're being told again and again. And there's another error, the error that there's a consensus among scientists as to when personhood begins. So here we have another quotation. Every human embryologist worldwide states that the life of a new individual human being begins at fertilization. Well, I'm telling you then, it doesn't. So I'm an embryologist, so this statement is wrong. Actually, many embryologists do not believe that individual human life begins at fertilization. Here are 4 places where different embryologists have claimed individual human life begins. There's fertilization, there's gastrulation, there's the human acquisition of the EEG pattern, and then there's birth itself. So let's go through a little bit on each of them. Fertilization, that's this genetic approach that you become a person when you get your DNA. And Lejeune, one of the leading geneticists, pediatric geneticists, said, oh, that takes place at fecundation, at fertilization, at conception, because it tells us that the constitution of this person is unique to this person. Okay? So that's one position. Life begins at fertilization. A second position is that life begins at gastrulation. Now, gastrulation is also sometimes called individuation. It's the time during human development where the cells receive their fates, such they are no longer pluripotent. They can't form twins or triplets anymore. And as Lewis Wolpert said, it is not birth, marriage, or death, but gastrulation, which is truly the most important time in your life. Renfrey, a biologist, says, assuming that monozygotic twins each have separate souls, it follows that ensoulment must occur after cleavage, at least 12 days after conception. And Green, a bioethicist, concurs, but twinning and fusion events suggest that even well after the formation of the zygote, biological individuality is not firmly established. Only at gastrulation can we say that the lengthy process of individuation has begun. So that's when an embryo becomes only one newborn, as opposed to having the ability to become 2, 3, even 4 newborns. So we have fertilization, gastrulation. A third position is that personhood begins when the fetus acquires the human-specific electroencephalogram pattern, its brain waves. This occurs about week 24 to 28, and it marks the physiological beginnings of consciousness. So this says that we have a human-specific brainwave pattern. And there's an interesting symmetry to this. In America, we say that you are legally dead when you flatline, when the EEG pattern vanishes. So according to this view, you are alive as an individual human being when that EEG pattern emerges. So before the EEG pattern, you're not a person, and after the EEG pattern, you're not a person. So such humans are treated with respect. You don't eat a corpse, for instance, but they are not members of human personhood. So this is a third argument, that personhood begins when you get the EEG pattern. Fourth argument is that human personhood begins at or around the time of birth. It's a time of legal personhood, a time where one gets one identity. Jeffrey Baker, for instance, says, birth is not merely a move from one room to another. It's a very dangerous passage. It's a discontinuity between fetal and newborn life. At birth, the lungs are used for the first time. They have to be able to function. Circulation is changed. Heart anatomy is changed. The fetus is different once it is born. So you have the positions of fertilization, day 1, gastrulation, day 12 to 14, EEG pattern, weeks 24 to 28, and birth at the end of gestation. Now, there's also a 5th position, which says this is a rather stupid question for scientists to be talking about because there is no one place that before it wasn't human and after it is human. The sperm and egg are both human. The acquisition of personhood is gradual. So, fertilization, gastrulation, electroencephalogram, the perinatal period around birth, and gradual humanization are all different positions taken by scientists. There isn't a consensus among scientists that life begins at fertilization or at any other place. Now, let me mention a few kind of sociological caveats here. When one says that a zygote or an early embryo equals a person, one has to remember it works both ways. When I talk about an embryo, that embryo is an it. It is not considered a he or a she, for instance. It is an it. We don't want to make people its. People are distinguished from inanimate objects and even other animals by being given a different pronoun. So that's one thing. We do not want to make a who into an it. If you say a fetus or an embryo or a zygote is equivalent to a person, you run that risk. Also, and this was a question originally asked by a right-to-life physician, if you were to enter a fertility clinic and you find that the fertility clinic has a fire and you see the receptionist lying, with her face on the desk, and you see a canister next to her that says 1,000 human embryos, but you can carry only one out of the burning office, which or who do you carry out? You don't have to answer that aloud, but just think about it. What would you do in that situation? And that will tell you if you really think that an embryo is a person. So we are constantly being exposed to media images suggesting that DNA is equivalent to soul, that fertilization is ensoulment, that the fetus is autonomous. None of these are scientifically valid. There are at least 5 places where scientists have claimed personhood begins. There's no consensus that personhood begins at fertilization or anywhere else.